The morning mist clung to the palace gardens like a gauzy veil, softening the edges of the fountains and statues that lined the cobblestone paths. Thomas Hale adjusted the strap of his ceremonial sword, boots pressing firmly against the damp stones as he patrolled the outer corridors. His eyes, trained by years of service, scanned every shadow, every flicker of movement, every whisper of life in the palace grounds. The Hale family had guarded this royal household for generations, and he bore the weight of their legacy with solemn pride. Even at this early hour, the palace hummed with life. The faint echo of laughter drifted from the distant nursery where Princess Charlotte and Prince George played, carefree and unaware of the currents of tension threading through the estate. Servants moved silently along the corridors, heads bowed, gliding past polished wood panels and gleaming marble floors, each step a testament to precision and training. Yet beneath the calm, Thomas sensed an undercurrent of unease, a subtle shift that told him today was not like any other day. He paused at the base of the forgotten tower, an ancient structure tucked behind a series of hedges and overgrown vines, largely unused and shrouded in whispers among the palace staff. Few ventured there, and even fewer knew the secrets it had held over centuries. The air carried a damp, earthy scent, tinged with the faint metallic tang of history. Thomas had always treated the tower as nothing more than a relic, a quiet monument to the past. But today, his instincts whispered that it might become the stage for events the palace could never anticipate. As he adjusted his coat against the chill, a faint noise caught his attention, a rustle of silk against stone, deliberate and careful. Thomas froze, senses sharpening. Footsteps echoed softly above him, yet they were not his own. His gaze swept upward, following the spiral of the tower staircase, darkened by shadows in the muted light of morning. Something or someone was moving inside. The hairs on the back of his neck rose instinctively. In his years of guarding the royal family, he had learned to trust these subtle alerts, the tiny disturbances that often heralded danger or deception. And then he saw her, Queen Camilla, unmistakable in her regal poise, her gown flowing like liquid silk as she ascended the spiral stairs. Her expression was unreadable, guarded behind a mask of composure. Yet there was a sharpness in her eyes that Thomas immediately recognized. Calculation, intent, secrecy. The queen rarely ventured into the tower, its isolation making it a perfect place for matters she wished to conceal. The fact that she was there now, unaccompanied, set every alarm bell in Thomas's mind ringing. He ducked behind a thick stone column, boots silent against the worn floor. From this vantage point, he could see her clearly, moving with deliberate caution as she reached the upper level. Her hands clutched a small, ornate box, its polished surface gleaming faintly in the filtered light. Thomas's pulse quickened. The queen's movements were purposeful, every gesture precise, and yet the secrecy surrounding them was unlike anything he had witnessed in his years of service. Something important, something potentially dangerous, was hidden in that box, and the weight of its significance pressed on him like a living thing. Thomas's mind raced. The palace was a labyrinth of duties, ceremonies, and strict hierarchies. But this intrusion into the forgotten tower was an anomaly. He had seen courtiers hide documents, servants conceal messages, and even senior aides navigate secret channels. But a queen herself venturing into a neglected tower with such discretion was unprecedented. His training and instinct told him he needed to observe carefully, to document every movement without being seen. Yet his loyalty to the royal family's safety made him wonder what might happen if the contents of that box fell into the wrong hands or were concealed from the heirs of the realm. From his concealed position, he noted the way the light played across her face, illuminating the subtle tension in her jaw, the slight narrowing of her eyes, as if she were calculating the risks of discovery. The faint sound of her breath, measured and controlled, mingled with the distant coo of birds and the whisper of the morning wind against the tower walls. Thomas adjusted his grip on his sword, though he knew the blade would not be his first line of defense today. Observation, discretion, and moral vigilance were his true weapons, and they were all the more essential as he watched the queen reach a hidden alcove within the tower. Camilla knelt, placing the ornate box against the cold stone floor. She opened it with deliberate care, the hinges clicking softly in the silence. Thomas leaned closer, careful to remain unseen, and glimpsed the contents. Documents, gilded papers, and small, intricate objects that glinted faintly in the light. He recognized the significance immediately. These were not mere trinkets or ceremonial items. They were personal artifacts, perhaps forgotten treasures. But more importantly, they were items capable of altering the balance of influence within the royal household. The knowledge that these had been hidden and that Camilla had come alone to retrieve them sent a chill through him. A sudden sound, a whisper of movement behind him, made Thomas freeze. He pressed against the column, holding his breath, every nerve taut. The palace staff rarely ventured this far, and he knew any misstep could compromise both his position and the secrecy of what he had just witnessed. He forced himself to stay calm, counting each heartbeat, letting the queen's actions unfold before him. She seemed unaware of his presence, entirely focused on the contents of the box, as if the outside world had ceased to exist. The queen's fingers traced the edges of a gilded document, the ornate handwriting catching the filtered light. Thomas recognized the signatures, long-deceased courtiers, past royal family members whose influence had lingered through generations. The significance was staggering. These were secrets buried decades ago, now resurfacing at a moment only Camilla knew. A part of him feared the implications. What if these papers exposed scandals, private agreements, or hidden claims that could shake the entire palace hierarchy? What if she intended to use them to manipulate or control members of the royal family? He exhaled slowly, careful to remain silent, and stepped slightly to get a better view. The queen lifted a small, intricately designed pendant from the box, turning it over in her hands. Thomas's mind raced with possibilities. This was not mere curiosity or sentimental hoarding. This was deliberate, strategic action. Camilla was taking measures that could influence the line of succession, sway loyalties, or conceal truths that others, most importantly, the young royals, had a right to know. The stakes were immense, and Thomas understood that his next steps would be critical. As she carefully replaced the items in the box and closed the lid, Thomas realized the precariousness of the moment. He had been trained to follow commands, to guard the palace, to obey orders without hesitation, but this was different. This was moral vigilance. This was protecting the integrity of the royal family, even against a sovereign whose motives were shrouded in secrecy. He felt the familiar, heavy weight of duty pressing against his chest. To do nothing could allow manipulation, concealment, or worse. To act could mean defiance and personal risk unlike any he had known. Camilla rose slowly, her gaze sweeping the tower as if ensuring she had not been observed. Thomas pressed himself closer to the shadowed wall, heart hammering in his chest. Every instinct screamed that the queen was up to something profound, something that, if discovered, could shift the palace's balance of power, influence, and trust. The young guard understood one immutable truth. Knowledge alone was dangerous, but action carried consequences that would ripple through the royal family for weeks, months, perhaps years. And then, without warning, Camilla paused at the doorway, her eyes narrowing toward the stairwell. Thomas froze, unsure if she had sensed him or if it was merely instinct. The quiet tension was absolute, every second stretching into an eternity. Outside, the wind rustled through the tower's overgrown vines, carrying with it a faint sense of foreboding. The queen's secret, whatever it was now on the verge of revelation or confrontation. Thomas Hale exhaled slowly, gripping his sword, not for attack, but for the certainty of readiness. Whatever the queen had hidden in the forgotten tower, he knew this was only the beginning. And as she descended the spiral stairs with her box clutched tightly, a single thought anchored him. The royal family would never be the same once the truth of this morning came to light. Thomas pressed himself against the shadowed wall, heart hammering as he watched Queen Camilla descend the spiral stairs of the forgotten tower. The ornate box remained clutched to her chest, its significance radiating through her every measured step. Even from his hidden vantage, he could sense the weight of her intent, a deliberate secrecy that was rare even for her. Something about her movements today was different, heavier, more purposeful, and he knew instinctively that the palace, in its sprawling elegance, was about to be shaken in ways no one could anticipate. The morning air carried faint sounds of the estate awakening. Birds chirped in distant gardens, A servant's boot tapped hurriedly against stone corridors, and the rustle of leaves whispered like secrets through the hedges. Yet within the tower, the quiet was unnatural, charged, and suffocating. Thomas's trained eyes caught the smallest details. A curtain fluttering in a way that suggested someone had brushed against it recently, the faint scuff of a shoe where it shouldn't be, and the glint of sunlight off metal that seemed deliberately placed to draw attention. These were subtle disturbances, small ripples on the surface of a larger, hidden current. He crouched slightly, moving silently along the stone ledge, following the queen's path from a safe distance. She paused near a narrow window, the box resting against the ledge, and adjusted the folds of her gown with precise, deliberate care. The quiet creak of the floor beneath her was faint but audible to Thomas's trained ears. He noted the way her eyes flicked toward the stairwell, scanning for anyone who might intrude. Her caution was meticulous, almost ritualistic, and he understood immediately that whatever she was hiding required absolute discretion. As he rounded a corner, the faint sound of movement reached him from above the soft, hurried footsteps of someone unseen. Thomas stiffened, gripping the ceremonial sword at his side. It wasn't Camilla. She had already descended. The figure was lighter, smaller, cautious but deliberate. From the shape of the movement, he guessed it was a palace staff member, someone who had been trained in secrecy. The sound carried a subtle urgency, a sense that they were carrying information or an object too sensitive to be noticed by others. Thomas adjusted his position, peering through the shadows to observe without being detected. A young aide emerged from a hidden passage near the tower's entrance, clutching a bundle of folded papers with trembling hands. He paused, glancing around nervously, and Thomas realized this was no ordinary morning errand. The aide's furtive glances suggested that the contents of the papers were important, perhaps even dangerous if discovered by the wrong eyes. Every instinct in Thomas's body screamed caution. One misstep, and the Queen's secrecy or his own observation could be compromised. The children, Charlotte and George, were nowhere in sight, yet Thomas remained aware of their presence elsewhere in the palace. His protective instincts, honed over years of service, sharpened with every subtle disturbance. The young royals were blissfully unaware of the machinations unfolding just beyond the polished walls of their home. If Camilla's actions were discovered or misinterpreted, the implications could extend far beyond hidden documents and forgotten artifacts. Lives, reputations, and the delicate balance of the household were all at stake. A soft metallic click echoed faintly from the tower's inner chamber. Thomas stiffened, recognizing the sound immediately, the lid of a box or container being secured. Camilla had placed her treasures carefully, sealing them from view. Yet the sound also suggested she had taken precautions against intrusion, a warning in itself. He pressed back against the wall, realizing that even a slight misstep could reveal his presence. Every sense was heightened, every muscle coiled for instant reaction. From the stairwell came another noise, a whisper of silk against stone. Thomas's eyes flicked toward the shadowed corridor above. A governess, cautious and deliberate, had emerged quietly, peering toward the tower with eyes wide but alert. She moved to intercept a small delivery left at the base of the stairs, glancing around nervously before taking it in her hands and retreating toward the main wing of the palace. The movement, though subtle, suggested urgency. Messages were being passed, items moved, and secrecy maintained, with a level of coordination that hinted at something far larger than a simple errand. Thomas's pulse quickened. He understood that the Queen's presence in the tower and the hidden deliveries were interconnected. Someone or something was being safeguarded, shielded from the rest of the palace. The implications were enormous. Every instinct honed over years of guarding the royal family told him that this was no ordinary action. Camilla's careful planning, the subtle disturbances, the hesitant aides, all indicated a scheme or revelation powerful enough to shake the very foundations of the household. A soft whisper reached him from the staircase above. Thomas froze, listening intently. Must remain hidden until instructed. The words were faint, yet unmistakable. His mind raced, piecing together fragments. Secret box, hidden documents, clandestine instructions. The Queen had orchestrated a plan with precision, and someone within the staff was ensuring its continuity. The palace, in all its grandeur, had become a web of secrecy, with Thomas observing a single thread that could unravel everything. He stepped lightly along the stone ledge, moving closer to the stairwell to gain a better view without being seen. From this vantage point, he could see a second aide approaching the tower's entrance, carrying a small package wrapped in velvet. Their movements were careful, almost ritualistic. Yet every gesture carried urgency. The hidden box, the secret papers, and the Queen herself were all part of a complex plan that Thomas had only begun to understand. The subtle disturbances were the signals, the breadcrumbs leading to a truth far larger than anyone had anticipated. Charlotte's small laughter drifted faintly from the nursery, a jarring contrast to the tension in the tower. Thomas's gaze flicked toward the distant sound, his protective instincts sharpening. The children were blissfully unaware of the unfolding drama, and he resolved that they would remain that way. Whatever the Queen's motives, the innocents must not be drawn into the storm. His duty was clear: observe, assess, and act if necessary to protect them from the repercussions of secrecy and deception. Suddenly, a shadow flickered across the top of the staircase. Thomas stiffened, realizing that someone else had entered the tower unseen, another staff member, perhaps, or a distant relative with access to the inner chambers. The figure moved silently, eyes scanning the room, and Thomas's breath caught. The palace had become a labyrinth of covert actions, and every subtle disturbance was a warning. Something significant was about to be revealed, and the consequences would extend beyond the tower's walls. He pressed back against the column, adjusting his stance to remain unseen, and exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. The Queen's actions, the hidden boxes, and the nervous aides all pointed to a secret powerful enough to shake the royal family. Thomas realized he was standing on the edge of discovery, observing the first ripple of a storm that would not stop until the truth was revealed. Every footstep, every whisper, every subtle movement in the palace now carried heightened significance, and he knew that the decisions he made next would determine not only his own fate, but the safety and legacy of those he was sworn to protect. Thomas Hale had trained for moments of crisis, but the subtle disturbances he was witnessing in the Forgotten Tower demanded more than obedience. They demanded vigilance, courage, and moral clarity. And as he watched the Queen ascend a second staircase, the box still clutched in her hands, he understood that the next moment would change everything. The palace was holding its breath, and so was he. The air inside the Forgotten Tower had grown heavy, carrying the faint scent of old stone and polished wood, mixed with the metallic tang of secrets long buried. Thomas Hale pressed against the shadowed wall, every sense alert, every muscle taut. He had followed Queen Camilla's movements from the lower corridor, observing the aides, the hidden packages, and the subtle disturbances that indicated a plan more elaborate than any he had ever witnessed. And now, as she reached the topmost chamber, he realized that the moment of revelation was imminent. Camilla moved with deliberate precision, placing the ornate box on a marble pedestal carved with intricate family crests. Her hands lingered over the lid, hesitation almost imperceptible, but there an indication that what she was about to reveal carried both weight and risk. Thomas's pulse quickened. He had glimpsed its contents briefly during the earlier moments of observation, but now the Queen herself was poised to expose whatever had been hidden from the rest of the palace, and perhaps even from the young royals she claimed to protect. Slowly, she lifted the lid. The first thing Thomas saw was the glint of a gilded crown, small but unmistakable, encrusted with jewels of deep emeralds and sapphires. His breath caught. It was not ceremonial, not decorative, it was personal. A crown that had been hidden decades ago, its provenance shrouded in secrecy. Around it were documents bearing signatures of long-deceased members of the royal household, detailing alliances, personal favors, and agreements that, if revealed, could shake the hierarchy of the palace. Thomas realized immediately that this was no trivial discovery. Camilla had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal these items, and now their unearthing had the potential to ignite scandal, conflict, and upheaval. A sudden scuffle of footsteps outside the chamber made him tense. Someone was approaching, likely drawn by the subtle disturbances he had noticed earlier. His mind raced. If the Queen was discovered in this private chamber, the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for her, but for the young royals whose names appeared repeatedly in the letters and documents. The pieces of this puzzle were intricate, and Thomas understood that he was caught in a storm of secrecy, with the safety of Princess Charlotte and Prince George weighing heavily on his conscience. Camilla, seemingly aware of his presence now, glanced toward the shadows. Her eyes narrowed, a mixture of surprise and recognition flashing across her face. "Thomas," she said, voice low but cutting. "You've been observing." I wondered how long it would take you to notice. There was no accusation in her tone, only the cold, deliberate calm of someone fully confident in their authority. But Thomas sensed the edge beneath it, the unspoken warning that defiance, if not careful, would have consequences. "I have," he admitted evenly, keeping his distance but stepping slightly into view. "And I understand why you came here, Your Majesty. But I must ask, why hide these items? Why conceal them in a tower forgotten by the palace itself?" His words were deliberate, calm, yet carried the weight of moral judgment. He had learned over years of guarding the royal family that courage was not always loud. It was often quiet, steadfast, and unwavering. Camilla's lips pressed into a thin line. "These are not matters for public scrutiny, Thomas," she said smoothly. "They pertain to the stability of this household, to the legacy of the family, and to decisions that must be made carefully, without interference. The palace is a stage, and some truths are dangerous if revealed prematurely." Her gaze flicked toward the gilded crown and documents, a subtle tremor of pride or perhaps fear crossing her features. "I am the steward of these secrets, and it is my duty to manage them." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "Duty, yes, but not when it endangered others. Not when it risked manipulation of the young royals. Not when the truth could be twisted for control rather than justice." He stepped closer, careful to remain respectful but firm. "And if someone else were to discover them? If these secrets fell into hands with less honor, less care?" His words hung in the chamber like the tolling of a bell. "The consequences could harm not only the family but the children you claim to protect." For the first time, the Queen's mask of unshakable control faltered. Her gaze hardened, sharp and deliberate, calculating the risk of exposure. "You presume much, Thomas. You presume to know what is best, to decide the value of secrets that span generations. And yet," she added softly, almost wistfully, "I sense your concern is genuine. You are loyal to this family. But are you willing to challenge me to protect them?" Thomas's jaw tightened. The choice was clear, though perilous. Obedience would maintain his position, preserve ceremony, and keep the formal order intact. But compliance would also leave the children vulnerable to manipulation, the secrets unchecked, and the moral integrity of the palace compromised. He could not, in good conscience, allow these items to be hidden while innocent lives and reputations hung in the balance. His decision would define not only his honor, but the safety of those entrusted to his care. He drew a slow breath, steadying himself. "I will ensure the children are safe, Your Majesty," he said firmly, voice unwavering. "But I cannot allow these secrets to remain hidden when they pose a risk to the family. My duty is to protect, even if it means defiance." The words were deliberate, carrying both respect and unflinching resolve. The chamber seemed to hold its breath, the shadows stretching long across stone floors, waiting for her response. Camilla's eyes narrowed further, and the tension in the room became almost tangible. She moved toward him, elegant but deliberate, as if testing the limits of his conviction. "You leave me no choice," she said quietly, her voice a whisper that carried authority as sharp as a blade. "To disobey is to challenge me directly. Are you prepared for the consequences of such defiance?" Thomas did not waver. "I am," he said simply, the weight of his oath settling over him like armor. "For the children, for the integrity of the family, and for the honor of this palace, I will not falter." His eyes flicked toward the crown and documents, then back at Camilla. "Whatever risks you intend, I will stand in the way if it endangers those I protect." A sudden sound outside the chamber froze them both, a quiet scuff, almost imperceptible, followed by the faint whisper of fabric against stone. Someone else was moving in the tower, drawn perhaps by the disturbances Thomas had tracked earlier. He knew immediately that the moment of confrontation was far from over. The palace hierarchy, the hidden secrets, and the moral imperatives all converged in that chamber. And Thomas felt the pressure of responsibility as acutely as he had ever felt. Camilla paused, eyes flicking toward the stairwell, then back at Thomas. There was a faint, almost imperceptible sigh acknowledgement, perhaps of his resolve, or perhaps a warning that the next actions would escalate the consequences for both of them. Thomas pressed his advantage, carefully observing her movements, noting every hesitation, every slight shift in posture, every trace of calculation. He was aware that the fate of the children, the palace, and the secrets themselves rested on the choices made in the next few moments. The chamber was silent, but for the faint click of the box lid and the distant sounds of the palace waking, Thomas knew that the delicate balance of power, secrecy, and moral responsibility was poised on a knife edge. Any wrong move, any lapse in judgment, could trigger consequences far beyond his control. And yet, despite the looming threat, he felt a quiet certainty. The protection of the young royals and the preservation of truth were worth every risk, every repercussion, every shadowed glance. In that moment, Thomas Hale understood that the Forgotten Tower was no longer merely a relic of the past. It was a crucible, a stage on which the integrity, courage, and honor of the palace would be tested. The Queen's secrets, the hidden crown, the documents of influence all were part of a narrative that demanded careful navigation, moral clarity, and unwavering resolve. And Thomas, as always, was ready to face the consequences. The chamber was thick with tension, every breath seeming to echo off the stone walls of the Forgotten Tower. Thomas Hale remained rooted, his eyes locked on Queen Camilla, who stood with the ornate box clasped tightly to her chest. The hidden crown and documents were no longer a mystery to him, and the weight of their significance pressed on his conscience. Each item in that box carried potential consequences, capable of reshaping alliances, loyalties, and trust within the royal household. Thomas knew the moment had arrived. Action would determine not only the fate of secrets, but the safety of the young royals he had sworn to protect. Camilla's gaze was steady, calculating. Yet a flicker of surprise passed over her face, as she realized Thomas had not only discovered her secret, but had also chosen to confront it. "So, you've seen everything," she said, voice quiet but edged with authority. "Do you understand what this means? Do you understand the weight of the knowledge you now carry?" Her words were deliberate, each one heavy with the unspoken threat of consequences, yet Thomas did not flinch. "I do, Your Majesty," he replied evenly, voice calm but firm. "And I also understand my duty. These secrets, as important as they may be, cannot be used to harm the children or manipulate the family. My oath is to protect, even if it means opposing you." His declaration reverberated through the chamber, a challenge framed not by disrespect, but by moral clarity. He had reached the boundary between obedience and conscience, and there was no turning back. Camilla's lips pressed into a thin line. For a heartbeat, the chamber held only silence, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Then, with deliberate precision, she stepped forward and placed the box on the marble pedestal. Her hands hovered over the lid, a subtle hesitation betraying her composure. "You are daring," she said softly, almost admiringly. "Few have had the courage or the audacity to oppose me openly. But do not mistake this for weakness. Knowledge alone is dangerous, and defiance carries consequences you may not yet comprehend." Thomas's pulse quickened, but he did not waver. He kept his eyes on her, every muscle tense, but controlled, ready to respond to any sudden movement. He could feel the hidden currents of palace politics pressing in, the weight of centuries of loyalty and secrecy converging in the Forgotten Tower. Outside, distant footsteps hinted that aides and staff were already aware of unusual activity, their whispers threading through the halls like fragile strands of tension, amplifying the uncertainty within the chamber. "Then let us proceed carefully," Thomas said, voice low. "I am willing to bear the consequences of my actions, Your Majesty, but I cannot allow harm to come to Princess Charlotte, Prince George, or any member of this family as a result of hidden truths or manipulations. Whatever you intend with these items, it must not threaten them." His words carried the authority of someone who had served the palace for years, whose loyalty was unwavering yet guided by conscience. For a long moment, Camilla studied him, the flickering light casting shadows across her face. Then, to Thomas's surprise, she exhaled and slowly nodded. "Very well," she said, her tone softer, though still measured. You will see only what is necessary. The rest remains hidden for now. But understand this. Not every secret can or should be revealed. Some truths are dangerous, and protecting them is a responsibility I have borne alone for decades. Thomas stepped closer, eyes never leaving hers. And yet, Your Majesty, the children's safety and the family's integrity cannot be secondary to secrecy. That is my duty. I will ensure it. His words hung in the chamber like a promise, resonating with the weight of his oath and the centuries of Hale family service that had preceded him. Camilla studied him a moment longer, then opened the lid of the box slightly, revealing just enough for Thomas to confirm that the crown and documents were intact. She carefully replaced the lid and secured the clasps, her fingers lingering a moment over the gilded edges. The tension in the room remained, but there was a subtle shift, a recognition that Thomas's defiance, though dangerous, had been guided by honor, not rebellion. A sudden scuffing sound from the stairwell alerted Thomas to another presence. He moved instinctively, placing himself between the box and the doorway, eyes sharp. A young aide entered, clutching a note that had likely been delivered to the Queen earlier. The exchange was brief. Camilla gestured imperceptibly, and the aide retreated, the note still sealed. Thomas realized that even in this resolution, the palace's web of secrecy and intrigue continued to pulse, hinting at future revelations and hidden agendas. Charlotte's small voice floated up the spiral staircase from the nursery below, breaking the tension for a fleeting moment. "Thomas, are you there?" she asked, innocent and unaware of the drama unfolding just steps away. Thomas's chest tightened. Protecting her and George remained paramount, and the Queen's private maneuvers could never reach them. "We're safe, Princess," he whispered back softly, voice steady. "Nothing will harm you." Camilla's expression shifted, a subtle acknowledgement of his protective role. "Perhaps," she murmured, "you have earned a measure of my respect today, Thomas Hale. But the palace is a place of shadows and whispers, and not all actions are without consequence." Her words were cautionary, yet they carried a grudging recognition of his courage and integrity. Thomas exhaled slowly, allowing himself a brief moment of relief, though he remained alert. The crown and documents, though secured, were a reminder that the palace was never fully safe from secrets, manipulation, or intrigue. His duty was ongoing, vigilance perpetual. Yet for the moment, the immediate threat had been mitigated, and the children remained untouched by the storm of hidden truths. Then, without warning, the chamber doors creaked as a shadow moved across the threshold. Thomas's hand tightened on his sword, muscles coiled, ready for any threat. A tall figure entered, face partially obscured, carrying an air of authority and urgency. Camilla's eyes flicked toward them, a subtle tension passing over her features. Thomas realized instantly that the shadowed figure was someone from within the palace, perhaps a distant relative or senior aide, drawn to the forgotten tower by the disturbances he had tracked earlier. The newcomer paused, their gaze sweeping across the chamber, taking in the box, the Queen, and Thomas himself. "Your Majesty," the figure said, voice low and measured, "there is something you need to see. Now." The words, deliberate and commanding, sent a shiver through the room. Thomas's instinct screamed that this was far from over. The revelation of the hidden crown and documents was only the beginning. Camilla's lips pressed into a thin line, and she exchanged a glance with Thomas, whose eyes met hers steadily. Whatever was coming, he knew they were standing on the threshold of a storm. The palace, its secrets, and the young royal's safety would all be tested in the moments ahead. And Thomas, as always, was ready to act, honor-bound and vigilant, even as the shadowed figure stepped closer, carrying news that would shake the royal family to its core. The forgotten tower seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move, the next revelation, and the next choice. And in that charged silence, Thomas understood one immutable truth. Tonight, the palace would never be the same.